particularly distinctive about today's event, maybe three. One is it's among the first events in this, our new location at Bruegel, our new meeting room. A second is it's probably one of the very few events you will be at this week where Brexit is not a central theme. And third, we have some new capabilities for you to enjoy the presentation, to be able to view the presentation. So, Bryn?
Thanks, Scott. Thanks. Hi, I'm Bryn. I work in the events team here at Bruegel. You'll notice at the top of your list of participants, there's some instructions as to how to connect to something called Share Link. It's a way of watching the slides on your portable device. So I'm speaking mainly to the people at the back, because I know the screens can be quite far away. So your smartphone or tablet, you'll be able to watch the slides on that. Today is the first time we're using it, so I'd appreciate if people could give it a go and then give me some feedback afterwards. I'll be out in the reception room there, because we've never used it before, and so hopefully it will work. And if it does, we'd love to hear a bit about what the user experience is. So thank you very much. Scott?
Thank you, Bryn. And with that, I'd like to hand off as quickly as possible to our speakers. Today is, of course, the role of market definition in a globalized economy. Bruce Lyons and Amelia Fletcher, who are both with the Center for Competition Policy at the University of East Anglia, have completed a very interesting, very thoughtful report. It should be understood, I think, in the context of a series of other work that's been done on geographic market definition. Earlier work by Lars Hendrik Ruller in a similar topic. We have one of his colleagues here today to speak about that as well, just briefly. With that, I'd like to hand off to our speakers. So, Amelia, off you go.
Thanks very much. And I think this will therefore be the first conference I've ever been at when people are looking at their phones. You'll know they're listening to you. Right, I'd like to, we're going to present, Bruce and I, pretty briefly, this piece of work we've done for the European Commission. We're going to do it as a double act. I'm going to start just with the introduction and leave Bruce to do the difficult bit. And I should just say, Brexit's already been mentioned. We did this piece of work before we ever dreamed that the UK would unilaterally change geographic market definition in this way. We won't talk about it further, unless you want to. Okay, so why do we care about geographic market definition? Hang on, where am I? Here we are. There we are. Okay. Why do we care about it? It's because it is a prerequisite to calculating market share. You all know that. We also know that it remains the case that that market shares are considered central to evaluating economic incentives and continue to really be the most powerful statistic in merger control. We know, it's quite a slow clicker. We know that clickers don't work very well. Oh, okay.
Yes.
Okay, there we are. Sorry. There we are. Okay, we know that market shares aren't decisive. We know that actually economists and indeed authorities are a little schizophrenic about how much weight they place on market shares. And indeed, this is reflected in the horizontal merger guidelines, where they say the larger the market share, the more likely a firm is to possess market power. But they're only first indications of market power, but they are normally important factors in the assessment. So you kind of see that schizophrenia right there in that paragraph. But nevertheless, relevant geographic markets, clearly an important part of the merger process. What do we mean by it? This is the legal answer from Hoffman-LaRoche. The relevant geographic market comprises the area in which the undertakings concerned are involved in the supply and demand of products or services, and in which the conditions of competition are sufficiently homogeneous and sufficiently distinguished from other areas where the conditions of competition are different. Now, we actually think this idea of conditions of competition is a really nice one, but the idea of supply and demand doesn't actually help you that very much, because they're not necessarily aligned in geographic market definition. If you look at the demand side, the customers, they may actually be in quite a different place to where the suppliers are, and where do you start? So how about...
Well, it's fast.
This is, I'm not touching it. I don't know what to do about this. I don't know what happened on the mobile phones at this point.
But just talk.
Can you see if you can get us back to where we were? And I'll carry on talking from my written slides. So what does the economic answer tell us? Obviously, we know that economics, we take the hypothetical monopolist approach to market definition. So we say, would a hypothetical monopolist in a particular area be able to raise its price profitably? If not, we widen the market. And we do that on the basis of demand-side substitution. So that's the ability and willingness of customers to switch to suppliers located elsewhere. And that's fairly uncontroversial. Yeah, if we could go back to slide, I don't know.
Just keep going.
Okay. And then supply-side substitution, which is actually one of the big questions that we look at in this study. But the idea of supply-side substitution is that you look at the ability and incentive of firms located elsewhere to find marketing channels, utilise spare capacity, and otherwise switch production into the market in the short term. So, what were the research questions behind our report? The background concerns, which are essentially highlighted by industry groups, lobbying, essentially, the Commission, were that the core of Commission merger analysis was the detailed definition of market definition, the relevant market, and that they didn't place enough weight on the competitive assessment bit. So once you'd got to your market definition, that concluded proceedings in at least some cases. And that, given the weight placed to geographic market definition, actually geographic markets were defined too narrowly, especially given globalisation. So the key questions, are we able to move yet? No. The key questions posed by the Commission for this project were, does the Commission use the right methodology when doing geographic market definition? And in particular, should a wider supply-side analysis, should they be more flexible in terms of their supply-side analysis to allow for globalisation and allow markets to be defined more widely on a geographic basis? And second question, if actually narrow geographic markets are appropriate, does the Commission sufficiently look at constraints from outside the geographic market in its competitive analysis? So what we did is we looked at 10 case studies that the Commission brought for us, and we're going to talk very briefly through those 10 case studies, which will be even harder without the slides, and maybe we'll get there. And then I'm going to hand over to Bruce to talk about the key findings and recommendations. So, but first of all...
We have a rumour that it's working now.
Aha.
A rumour it's working? Yeah, it should be. I do apologise very much for that.
Okay.
The choice of
Okay.
technology.
Very good. Thank you very much. So, okay. So what we did, essentially the Commission chose for us 10 recent cases to look at, 10 recent merger cases, and to look at what had been done on geographical market definition. Our primary focus was on the published decisions, but we did also have access to confidential versions of the decisions and some additional technical and market investigation evidence. Now, the first thing to really highlight is this was not a kind of random, unbiased sample. This was a sample of cases chosen by the Commission because they actually raised difficult and contested issues of geographic market definition. There was only one unconditional clearance amongst the set, for example. They chose them because there were different levels of geographic market definition adopted. There was national, regional, EEA, and global. There was some phase 1, some phase 2. There were different types of industrial sector. So the idea was that it would be a small but revealing sample. And these are, it's doing it again, so these are the markets that we looked at. And what you can see in orange are, basically we separated them by type of market. They covered a wide variety of types of market, but the key point to highlight is that the ones in yellow there were basic industrial goods. So there was quite a strong prevalence of basic industrial goods, things like steel, bleach, PVC, zinc.
Can I make a suggestion?
Yes?
Why don't you simply say next slide when you're ready to advance?
Okay.
From the cockpit over here.
Okay.
I'm terribly sorry.
That's okay.
I now really look forward to all the feedback we're going to get.
It's not Brexit. Punishment for Brexit.
It's not, Julio suggested this is a punishment for Brexit. I couldn't help it, I did my best. Anyway, what we found, what this slide shows you is essentially what the Commission found by way of market definition and what the parties argued, and also what the Commission found in terms of constraints from outside. And what is very clear is that there was lots of disagreement on geographic market definition in almost all these cases. These are the cases where a significant impediment to effective competition was found. In all of these cases, the parties argued that the market was wider than the Commission found. And in many of these cases as well, the Commission found that there was insufficient constraint from outside the market to really to limit the effect of the merger. So, in that context, you can see why people are concerned. You've got parties always arguing that the markets are wider and the Commission always going for narrower markets, apparently on the basis of these cases, and then the Commission ignoring these constraints from outside the market. But two things to absolutely highlight. First of all, actually, if you're a party and you're facing the Commission, it doesn't cost you much to argue for a wider market definition, so you kind of always would. So actually, it doesn't mean that when they've argued for wider market definition, they've always done it with great conviction. And these cases actually varied in terms of the amount of evidence that was really put forward on it being a wider market definition. But the other point to highlight here is this is a biased sample. As I said, these are SIEC markets. It's hardly surprising in that case that the parties were unhappy with the analysis done by the Commission. So what we tried to do, next slide, is actually look at the same mergers, but some of the markets where SIECs weren't found. So these are ones where actually the parties might be content with what the Commission did. And actually in these cases, often there was agreement on the market definition, and actually the Commission, even if it did define the market relatively narrowly, said, we see there are constraints from outside the market, we accept those constraints from outside the market. Therefore, actually, if you look more generally, beyond the very narrow set of SIEC cases, it's not anything like as obvious that the concern that was raised about the Commission was valid. Next slide, please. Yeah. So our report, what we did in our report is to examine 6 types of evidence on geographic market definition. The 6 types that were highlighted in the Commission notice of 1997. Geographic pattern of purchases, demand characteristics, trade flows, barriers and switching costs, economic evidence, and views of customers and competitors. We're not going to go through all this. There's lots and lots of interesting stuff that we found by looking at the use of this evidence across these 10 cases, particularly in the area of the economic evidence. We could talk about some of that later, maybe. But what we want to highlight, and I'm going to now hand over to Bruce, is the key findings we found. Sorry, Bruce.
Okay, thanks. Next. And there we go. First, I think it's important to just frame our findings in the fact that actually we didn't think there were any injustices that we found in any of these cases. It was generally well evidenced. There was a wide range of stuff used. It varied quite a lot between different cases. Partly because of data availability, but also, I think quite importantly, is that for some cases, market definition was never going to be a big issue. They're going to be decided on something else, so the effort goes elsewhere, which is perfectly appropriate use of limited resources. Where there was statistical, or sometimes referred to as economic evidence, this was usually wrapped up appropriately along with sets of other evidence. next. But we do have, so I mean, that's the basic sort of positive background framework, so I don't want to see this as a hammering thing, but we do have some substantive suggestions as to the way forwards. Can we have next, please? Firstly, I don't think, when we look at the evidence provided by the parties, and we were able to look behind the actual reports, not just the confidential versions, but also some of the submissions, it wasn't always obvious. It may have been, as Amelia suggested, that you know, why shouldn't we go for try and tackle everything along the way? But I think it is worthwhile clarifying once again publicly what the role of geographic market definition is, because there's a sense that it hasn't quite got across. And we'd say that it's important for identifying a geographically coherent group of customers whose purchases are similarly competed for by suppliers located in the same geographic area, and quite often also by firms in another geographic area. So it's this sort of conditions of competition, but from Hoffman and Loroche, but focusing on this geographically coherent group of customers who are being similarly competed for by the firms. The bottom of the slide, we just put that, you know, in a sense, this shouldn't matter too much, because we have this two-stage procedure of the geographic market definition. That gives you your market shares and things, and identifies the key players, and then the competitive assessment. Now, if you have defined the market too narrowly, let's say, that leaves more room for looking at the external constraints in the competitive assessment. But I don't want to overplay that, because market shares are important. They set presumptions and things like that. Next. Oh, sorry. Yes, that is the next. When you're not in control of these things, you're not quite sure where you are. Okay. The second one is probably or possibly the most controversial, given the background of people saying that markets are being defined too narrowly, and we need to take account of globalisation and things. And that is, we say that the Commission should be clear that it will not use supply-side substitution, including by imports, for geographic market definition. We come to where it should be, and in terms of the competitive assessment shortly. So in the Commission notice, you know, the possibility of supply-side substitution is mentioned. It's narrowed down where effects are equivalent to those of demand substitution in terms of effectiveness and immediacy. In a sense, that sort of opens up some things which we think perhaps opens up a little bit too much. There were cases, and there were three important cases that we list on this slide here, where the Commission does actively agonize over imports and whether the market should be included, sort of extended to where the imports come from. And this is something which we think is a dangerous way to go. And for the reasons hopefully become clear on the next slide, where we suggest a simple example, an illustrative example, which I think is hopefully quite powerful in sort of setting out why we come to this conclusion. So suppose you've got two large European firms located within the European Economic Area, and one major Chinese competitor, we call it ChinaCo, and they're all selling to EEA consumers. We'll say with a third market share each to keep it simple. ChinaCo is also supplying its own home Chinese market, and there it has a range of other competitors, perhaps located nearer China, that it's competing with. Now, ChinaCo is clearly a big competitor in Europe. but which market definition better frames the question for understanding the conditions of competition in the European market. If we go for the global market, we have a very large market. We're bringing in lots of other suppliers who aren't really very active on the European market, and we're giving those two large European firms much smaller market shares than their market shares in the EEA area. On the other hand, if we think of this right as the EEA area, where there is a very powerful China co-importer, and this affects the market shares of these European firms in Europe, and is imposing a competitive constraint, then that seems to us to characterize the key background to this sort of market, where you can begin an effective competitive assessment. Now, if alternatively, those two European firms were similarly competing in the Chinese market, and they were the big players over there, and China Co was the big player over here, then there would be much more of a case to suggest that there was a global market here, because then all the firms are competing in all of the places, and you might want to check about whether the conditions of competition were the same, whether similar prices or whatever are adjusted for costs. But in fact, in that case, the market definition wouldn't matter, because the European firms have got a third of the European market each and a third of the global market each. So, it's not quite so important a matter. This brings us on to the third recommendation. The Commission should clarify and develop its analysis of the supply-side discipline, particularly imports, into the competitive assessment. By the way, the term imports we have in mind here is anything which is from outside of the defined market. So we're using that as a generic term for from outside the geographic market as defined. And we've got an extended quote here about wherein Arsenal DSP, there's sort of a certain amount of agonizing over whether a 25 to 40, say a 35% market share held by Chinese producers of sodium benzoate, as it happens, would discipline the merger post-transaction. The simple example is it doesn't hold right across to this, by the way. I mean, I'm not saying that, but it provides an example of the next stage, which we think is going a little bit, or in danger of going wrong, that there's some critical market threshold, because there's reference to whether, well, in previous cases, 25% import share was enough to discipline this market. Now, that to us is clearly not right. What should matter is that, if the merging parties tried to raise price, would that suck in more imports? It's nothing to do with the absolute share of imports. It's to do with whether they would adjust to fill any gap of output constraint. In other words, in economic terms, the elasticity. This wasn't something which decided this case by any stretch. It was sort of dismissed, but we think it shouldn't be looked at in that way. And a further suggestion we have while we're on this is that very often in some of these mergers with large industrial products, bulk products, capacity shares are very important to the analysis within the market. Well, we think more could be done in terms of thinking of capacity shares or spare capacity, the ability for firms located outside the market to switch into their supplies into the market. Next. So we have a number of other suggestions. We'll go through slightly less quickly than that. The market definition tends to be member states, groups of member states, which is regional, EEA, or global. And if you think about local geography just around where we are here, that's sort of a where things are being delivered, it may be that the relevant market, if things can't be delivered more than, say, 300 kilometres, then that might not work exactly on member states as markets, but it might cut across that. Now, there are often problems about firms gathering data at that sort of level of disaggregation. I just think, or we just think that more work could be done on that. There's a pretty, when they're just analysing transport costs, the second point, the point of comparison changes in every case, and we think there could be something more systematic about considering transport costs. Sometimes it's to do with data availability, and we're very aware of that a lot of the time. A lot of markets, there are big international firms producing, and then distribution happens perhaps at the member state type level. Very often this is picked up, but one or two things might be developed on that. And certainly there are issues where there's vertical integration between production and distribution, where distribution is a key matter. And we could talk more about one merger. We think it's quite important to think about this in SSAB. But I'm aware of time, so we'll go on to the conclusions. Any of this can be developed in discussion. So our main conclusions then, it's not that the whole thing's broke, and we need to start from again with a completely new notice, a new way of going about things in an era of globalisation. We don't think so, but we do think that geographic market definition could do with the sorts of things we've been talking about: greater public clarity on its purpose, reserving imports and other supply-side analysis for the competitive assessment. Some development of tightening up in practice in these other things I just mentioned very briefly, and that at the same time there could be further development of that supply-side analysis in the competitive assessment. But I think I'll leave it there to keep within the time.
Thank you very much, and also thank you for being such good sports about the clicker. Well, with that said, our next speaker will be Hans Friedrichs. Did I butcher the name too badly? My goodness, and I'm a German speaker too. Hans, I'll keep it. Okay, fair enough. So he'll actually be speaking about some work that was done previously by Professor Röhler. It was done for the European Roundtable of Industrialists, so sort of the other side. Are the conclusions very different? Are they mostly the same, or are they somewhere in between? And with that, over to you.
Yeah, well, let's find that out jointly, I guess. Welcome to everybody. And indeed, I think it's a fascinating empirical experiment which has happened here. Because I understood that Amelia and Bruce, you haven't seen Hendrik's study before when you were drafting your report. So in a way, you have two completely independent observations, Bruce and Amelia's study and Hendrik's study. I will briefly introduce the ideas which were put forward in this ERT report. And as was said, so this is the European Roundtable of Industrialists, so a group of chairmen and CEOs of large European enterprises. And the specific points Hendrik made here in that study was that supply-side substitution and being defined here in a broader sense, also including potential entrant, is typically by the European Commission not applied within the competitive assessment, or applied in the competitive assessment and not within market definition. Even so, the market definition guidelines of the Commission opens at least some room to have that in some difference eventually to the US. And Hendrik was conjecturing that this may have caused specifically a problem in those kind of industries where you have rather strong supply-side substitution, but downstream you have national markets when serving the customers. And clearly you could argue, and just to make that also clear, to make that upfront very clear, I think everyone is on the side that both demand and supply side substitution has to be taken into account somewhere when assessing a case. The discussion which we are having here is whether it needs to get more room when doing market definition, and that is built on the assumption that market definition still plays somehow a role in the overall assessment of a case. But let me give you briefly the figures and numbers which were put together here by Hendrik. So this was a report written in 2009, a little bit time lapsed since then. He applied a completely different, somehow weaker methodology than Amelia and Bruce. He was using a count of the paragraphs within the decision and considering that as a measure for the importance of a specific argument in that decision. Clearly that's not as deep as if Amelia and Bruce are going through the document, but it gives you the benefit of reviewing more decisions and more markets. So he ended up with 37 cases, all phase 2 cases, merger cases from 2004 to 2008, brought by the Commission, covering 273 markets in those decisions. So actually the comparator approach was exactly the same as you are using, namely problematic decisions where there were market problems found, or competition problems found, and then taking the other markets within that decision where no seek was found in a way as a comparator or as a clean universe. So what were his findings? His findings were that in the minority of cases, or markets here to say, namely 44% of all of the 273 markets covered by the decisions, an EEA-wide or even global market was found. It was the other way around. It was the majority of cases was national or regional or local, and there was also a cluster around national cases. 37% of the cases, or in 37% of all markets, a national market was defined. Also to mention, because you were addressing the isochrone approach, there was only one case where an isochrone, a 500-kilometer isochrone, was defined. More to the point on supply-side substitution, he found based on the following statistic that supply-side substitution seemed to be underrepresented in market definition. Namely, he compared the number of paragraphs on supply-side substitution, including also potential entrants, I have to say, within the competitive assessment, so that's the 100%, and compared that to the paragraphs he found in the 37 decisions in market definition on supply-side substitution. And on average, you found that were 37% of the paragraphs compared to what you see in the competitive assessment. So there was much less room given to supply-side substitution within market definition than in the competitive assessment, if you accept that kind of an indicator clearly. And more interestingly, and even to the point of that question of regional market definition, this underrepresentation of supply-side substitutability in market definition was specifically prone then when the markets were not EA or global, so if the markets were national, regional, and specifically if they are local. Clearly, if you take that evidence, so say just finding 5% of the decisions or in the markets where local markets were defined addressing supply-side substitutability, then there are clearly two competing theories which could explain that. Either because supply-side substitutability is not prevalent in this kind of industry, and that's also the reason why they found a local market, hence it was not discussed, or the other way around, namely that because the Commission did not apply a proper assessment of supply-side substitutability and potential entrant, there was a bias towards local regional or national markets. Here he used his expert knowledge to conjecture that it is more the later, considering and hence coming to the conclusion that potentially supply-side substitutability should be addressed more. Given the short time I just have and the long panel, I have many points here we could discuss on various points. I just want to make two observations. When I were reviewing Amelia's and Brueg's study, I had the feeling they were very much consistent to each other. Namely in the sense that I read from your documents that you also were considering to give more room to potential entrant, at least in some specific situations, also under market definition, which I think is fully what was also Henrik's conclusion a few years ago. And you are pointing specifically to the point of better delineating the markets across the vertical chain, namely talking about distribution markets and wholesale markets, and thereby potentially bringing in or resolving that puzzle for industries which are rather European on a wholesale level, but rather local or national on a downstream level. So my feeling was, yes, it is consistent, but I'm also happy to hear what's your view on that. And I end, and there's a lot of stuff we could discuss later on. I end just with two observations. One point, whenever I, working in private practice, hear one of our clients saying, well, there's the case is not unproblematic because of imports from China, I know I have a problem. That's typically, I mean, it's changing over time. China is becoming stronger, and there's a true story behind it. But still it feels like being a good indicator to bring that case into phase 2. And the other observation I read in the good old paper from Damien Nevin, written somewhere in the 90s, Merger in Daylight. And he was reviewing, as you are now doing, the old merger decisions. And on imports, he gave the following remarkable quote from the Commission, which were concluding, from the demand side, the Italian market for sugar seemed to be a market open to imports because prices in Italy were higher than in neighboring countries. Wow, I think we came much closer to a sound economic analysis of cases since 1992 this was. Yeah, and with that I stop here and hand over to the next panelist.
Well, thank you very much, Hans. And let me suggest, I think it might be most productive if we give Amelia and Bruce a chance at the end to respond. Just note the things that you want to respond to. You clearly will need to. But I think it might be best if we collect them all together. Okay, and with that said, I'd like to give the floor to Raphael de Koning. Raphael is a vice president at CRA and also a professor at the Université Libre.
Thank you. Thank you. So before I jump into my comments, I will just say that the sugar market has changed a lot since the 90s. I think I owe that to my sugar clients. It's now going towards liberalization, and you don't have this type of difference in prices anymore. Good. So, all right. So, reading the excellent report here, it seems that really the starting point and or the testing hypothesis was, is the market defined too narrowly by the Commission? We've talked about, China, the role in China. When I was at the Commission, we were also discussing very often what's the role of India. Is it any better? I think there was not much consensus that this would be the case. But the question that I will try to address here is, well, actually, should it be looked at narrower, at least in some cases? And this was also hinted at by Bruce and Amelia when they mentioned that, well, in some cases, the Commission has looked a bit more narrowly, looking at isochrones or catchment areas of particular firm. And I think that's an important point, and maybe while we've seen actually more of those cases at the Commission, and I would think that it's a worthwhile development and probably something that we should see more in the years to come. Of course, that's not for every case. This concerns cases where competition is truly local. Typical example are cases in which transport costs are high, and cases, famous cases have happened in a few years, like for example in cement or can packaging, in which the Commission has looked at rather locally around plans of the merging firm what the condition of competition is. Well, actually, an interesting point is that when there is price discrimination, meaning that the parties and the companies can price differently to different consumers, one may actually want to not center the assessment and the local assessment on companies that are merging, but actually on their consumers, right, or the customers. Typically, those are large plans that will buy input from the merging parties, and what really matters when you have price discrimination are what are the competitive conditions that those customers will face when they go on the market and want to buy their input. This raises an interesting question practically, because when you do such an analysis, you have a vast, well, even if the number of customers is limited, there are more customers than countries, so you may have a bit of a dimensionality problem, at least in some industries. And the Commission has dealt with that by somehow clustering consumers, so looking at centering the assessment on consumers and then calculating market shares on clusters of customers. And here, it's an interesting point, one that actually is consistent with the point that you were making, that much of the analysis of the Commission is still done at national or supranational level. Well, actually, it's a mix here, in the sense that we are looking at the conditions of competition locally, and then we are somehow aggregating them at a higher level, which often corresponds to a member state or a group of member states. So it may actually make a lot of sense to do so, but I think it requires an extra step to show that indeed the conditions of competition are sufficiently similar within this cluster defined as a member state or a group of member states. Another point that I'd like to make in this respect is that when we think about this type of local competition, there's of course a lot of expertise in national competition authorities, and probably that's expertise that would be good to draw on in future cases also at the Commission. One particular point that I'd like to mention is how do we look at these local geographic markets? Well, the Commission typically has taken some kind of ad hoc or fixed arbitrary thresholds of distance when looking at a plant that is constant for the plans of the merging parties. Well, that's one way to do it, but it's not the finest way or the way that will most capture the conditions of competitions when you have, for example, different characteristics of plans that are merging. We can see the same type of question that arises in front of national competition authorities when they do their local analysis, which very often is when you have mergers of supermarkets. There also, you can have supermarkets that attract customers from far away and others that have different characteristics that are much more local, and one may raise the same type of question. But as I said, I think this is part of a new development at the Commission, a good one, but there's still a bit of learning by doing, and recently, actually in a recent case, I was asked to provide some interesting information by the Commission, which was doing this type of analysis and doing the isochrones, or the catchment area, and for one of them, because you may also be interested in local areas where those overlap, we were asked to provide local areas centered on the midpoint, that is, the point that is equidistant from the two plans of the merging parties. Well, it very much happened that in that case, which I won't name, this midpoint was in the middle of a forest in Poland. So, okay, as I said, there's a bit of learning by doing. But the important point here is that one should go beyond market shares, right? When we look at those local markets. I mean, it's fine to spend time and really looking at it in details, but in the end, the key question is the competitive assessment, and the geography and distance between the parties is an important element in this assessment. well, one can think in particular, and this is also something that the Commission has been doing much more, is actually using the distance between the plants from a customer perspective, trying to see which is the closest plant. For customers who have the other merging party as the closest plant, which one is the second closest, will that increase significantly as a result of the merger? And that's indeed very, very useful. This can also be done more formally if we think about the traditional upward pricing pressure indicators. Some of our colleagues in the US have come up with some adjustments to those for addressing local markets, what they call gravitational GUPI, which is basically just giving a particular weight to reflect the distance from the center, giving more weight to competitors that are closer and less to competitors that are further away, which is interesting, but in the end, it's just a question of diversion ratio, and distance can be an important factor in seeing how close competitors the parties are, and this is how it can come up in diversion ratio. Of course, the key question is it an assumption? How do you do it? Or do you actually base it on actual data where you have measured this closeness of competition between the parties? And in some cases, you may be lucky enough to actually do some econometric analysis to measure directly the impact of, let's say, the entry of one party in the local area of the other party. And this can give quite a lot of information on local diversion ratios. So the question is, should it be narrower? I think in some instances, probably yes, and I think that's good. We are seeing that. Another question, of course, is should it be broader? And maybe I'll make a link to the Brexit here, because I was reading this morning an interesting quote by the head of the telecom company SFR, who was saying, well, actually, Brexit is great because it will hopefully give an impetus to Europe to go away from this suicidal antitrust policies which prevent companies from becoming national champions. So that's indeed an interesting quote. I think it's not probably one that is best addressed through geographic market definition, but maybe through the competitive assessment there, and in particular through efficiencies. So if indeed a particular merger is to lead to such a great company, one should see that in the efficiencies. And well, we may question whether the Commission will recognize it or not, but I leave that for later. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Raphael. And we've heard a great deal about the Commission's practice. Now we're about to hear from the Commission. Giulio Federico, over to you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. Just a couple of disclaimers. One, as usual, I speak in my personal capacity, and even more so because I was involved in part in the selection of the cases for Bruce and Amelia, and the selection of the experts as well. So, of course, the substance of the report is entirely Bruce's and Amelia's. They work completely independently from the Commission, but I must say, at least at a personal level, we're very grateful for the work which was done really in an attempt to get an external view on this debate and on the Commission's assessment of a number of recent cases, the controversial one. And I think the report speaks for itself in terms of its content and clarity. I'd just like to make a couple of remarks based on the report and based on what has been discussed so far. The first is one important takeaway from the report, namely that we should be clearer about the relationship between market definition at the geographic level, supply side substitution, and competitive assessment. I think Amelia and Bruce are saying quite clearly, be very careful when you apply supply side substitution consideration to lead to broad geographic markets. And the default really should be to look at those issues as issues of entry and expansion that are more suited for the competitive assessment. And if you look at the US and UK guidelines in particular, that's very much the explicit position taken in those guidelines, that the substitution and supply side to broaden market is really only a matter of convenience, in the sense that when you have a number of markets on which suppliers compete in very uniform, homogeneous way, then you can conveniently aggregate across these markets. An example in the UK guidelines is bidding markets of bespoke products. You may have a tender for a given customer with some bespoke product, a tender for another customer in a different country with similar competitors by and large, then of course you could define the market around each customer, but that's a pain. You have lots of markets. If you aggregate across all of these tenders, you get actually more information, so more statistical information, and a much more efficient review of that merger. I think that's an important point. I mean, I think that the EC guidelines also have that, maybe in a less explicit fashion, but they make the point that for supply side substitution to be part of the market definition, it should be near universal, or it should be applying to most suppliers. So most suppliers should be in a position to really arbitrage across products and markets. And really, if you read most of the examples given here are actually on product market definition, not on geographic market definition. So it's about the production process being really quite equivalent across different grades of steel, different grades of paper, or grades of a chemical product. Everybody can switch back and forth quite easily, and therefore it makes no sense to, even though from a customer perspective the grades are different, the application may be different, it makes no sense to analyze each grade separately if all the suppliers on the production side can easily shift around production. So I think, as I said, steel was a good example. Outokumpu, this issue came up. Ineos Solvay on PVC was the same, and the like. So I think in the recent Staples Office Depot merger in the States, Shapiro gave expert evidence about clustering across markets. He made the example of shoes. And obviously, you want to cluster across different sizes of shoes. If you have a merger of shoe producers, you don't want to have a market for size 42 and a market for size 38. But when it comes to dress shoes and hiking boots, you want to be very careful about clustering. You may have very different competitive conditions across hiking boots and dress shoes. Now, when it comes to geographic market definition, you can see that this near universal substitution may be there or maybe not be there. And I think Bruce's and Amelia's example on China is very indicative. You know, you have one Chinese firm that's active in Europe, but actually there's lots of local Chinese producers that have never entered Europe, have no facility to enter Europe, have no intention to enter Europe. Aggregating across the whole of China, which is a huge market, clearly will distort your analysis in a very heavy way. Now, of course, if this is a small country, it doesn't really matter. You could do it. It won't affect greatly your analysis. If it's China, of course, it does create a strong distortion, which effectively means your market shares become a worse proxy for competitive effects, and a much better proxy for competitive effects is a market share that, yet, of course, includes the imports, the actual imports, but does not include producers who have never produced or sold in Europe and are not likely to do so. Having said that, of course, the market share remains a proxy, and you don't want to stop there. So all this debate is about what's the best proxy we can establish based on, you know, economic considerations, but then, of course, we don't stop at that proxy. And if you look at some, I mean, one example you have in this list is the banana mergers, Chiquita Fives. There, the Commission went for a narrower market definition, national markets. It didn't feel on the supply side there was enough substitution across member states, but then it effectively, you know, cleared the merger unconditionally, except for some a relatively smaller remedy around distribution exclusivity, because it felt that entry across member states in the banana markets was sufficiently easy, and competitive conditions in each member state was sufficiently competitive. Similarly, it's not a case on the list here, but in Gazprom Wingas, relating to wholesale gas markets in Germany and Netherlands, the fact that the hubs, you know, TTF in Netherlands and Germany, were sufficiently connected did not lead to it didn't lead to a departure from national markets, but led the Commission to be less concerned about the market power within Germany and the competitive effects of that merger. So the Commission does incorporate those issues in the competitive assessment, but I think it's right to be quite cautious in doing so in the market definition stage. Which kind of raises the question, I think the more difficult question perhaps, how do you incorporate this constraint from outside the market in a proper way? Do you, for example, allow for this swing capacity notion that I think is mentioned in the US guidelines? To be honest, I haven't seen a case yet where they've done it. Maybe it's in the guidelines, but not done in practice. It is a difficult exercise to compute how much capacity could go into a country if prices were to go up. The Commission, where the data was available in past cases, has looked at the responsiveness of imports to price differences historically. So looked at historical data on that issue. So this was done in zinc metal, in Glencore, in steel, and in part in SPVC. So at least you look at what's happened in the past to measure the responsiveness of imports, which is a way to get around that issue. I think it's an important point. It's one that the Commission has been trying to recognize, but where probably more work and more practice is useful. So those are my 2 points on the debate on should we go wider. On the other debate, I think Rafael here has made many of the points I was going to make. On the catchment area analysis, or isochrones, that Amelia and Bruce also recommend the Commission to engage more in. I think there's been quite a lot of recent work happening in parallel, and I would say partially encouraged by the report, but not causally linked to the report, during the last few months. So there was a chocolate case, industrial chocolate, Cargill, ADM. That was cleared, I think, when the report was being written, where there was a catchment area analysis for industrial chocolate in Germany. There was Wrexham, so beverage cans. So again, a catchment area analysis for across Europe. Again, so raising the issue of trans-border markets, not national markets, but markets that can cross borders. And then I felt there is exactly right, that when you have price discrimination, which is often the case for industrial cases that the Commission looks at, you really want to center your catchment area around customers. If you have thousands of customers, that's tricky. If you have 200, 300, like we had in beverage cans, that's more feasible, but nonetheless not straightforward. And there, I was looking for guidance from the NCAs on how to do it, and I asked Amelia, how did the UK do it? when do you center around customers? And actually, the NCAs, given that they deal more often with retail mergers, where there's no price discrimination, they often do center around the assets, the production sector, not around customers. So that's actually probably underdeveloped as an issue across Europe. In Wrexham, we try to push that boundary a little bit. And I think Rafael is right. It raises the issues of how do you cluster around customers? Are you clustering, if you cluster by member state, how do you deal with heterogeneity within the member state and assess that? Interesting, again, in the US, in the Cisco US Foods case, the FTC and their expert did something quite similar to what the Commission did in Wrexham. They looked at overlapping trade areas between assets, and then on those overlapping areas, did the circles around customers and computed concentration measures around the customers, and also looked at the most affected customers, the ones that would get the highest increase in concentration from the transaction. And that's a way, I think, to see whether, even though within a cluster the average effect may be X, some customers may be particularly affected by the transaction, and your remedy, if you have one, may need to really make sure that it deals with competition issues for those customers. But we look forward to the new version of the Salp-Moresi-Gappi on distance. I understand that developing to see how that can be improved further. I think I'll leave it at that for attending.
Thank you very much. And with that, I'd like to hand to our last speaker, Volker Stapper, providing from Deutsche Telekom, providing more of a view from a market player, from the industry. So with that, I'd appreciate if you could keep to 5 minutes since we're starting to run toward the end.
Thank you. I'll try to do that. Yeah, when preparing for this panel, I thought, which case can I contribute that where geographic market definition played a crucial role. And I actually quickly said, yes, we have one actually quite big case in the US when we tried to merge T-Mobile US with AT&T. That was 5 years ago. Where that played a major role. Just to give you a background, up until this case, the DOJ in the US had defined mobile markets locally, mainly, and that's different from Europe, because you have so-called cellular market areas, which basically means that spectrum is attributed at a local level. And that also led the authorities to conclude that competition was to be defined at a local level. Well, we then notified this transaction, and in the end, and make it very short, the DOJ and the FCC both concluded for the first time that actually there's a national market for mobile phone services, which then led to an investigation of a number 2 player and a number 4 player merging in the market, and they ended up blocking that merger. And as I said, one reason was the Geographic Market Definition. So that just a very brief overview of a case that happened 5 years ago. I think our sadness went away when we ended up getting our breakup fee, which I think was one of the biggest in the history of mergers, and so we took it from there. I brought another case, which is a lot more recent, which is also in the US. It's only a couple of weeks old. It's the Staples Office Depot merger, where a decision just came down. And I have to confess, the main reason why I chose this case was the first sentence that the U.S. District Court of Washington, D.C. Had as a decision. I want to read it to you because I just find it fascinating. It says, drawing an analogy to the fate of penguins whose destinies appear doomed in the face of uncertain environmental changes, Staples and Office Depot argue they are like penguins on a melting iceberg, struggling to survive in an increasingly digitalized world and an office supply industry soon to be revolutionized by new entrants like Amazon. So that's how the decision by the judge starts. You can imagine how this ends. Well, I'll give you
Poor penguins.
I'll give you a bit of background. This is actually a case that goes back in history. It was first notified in '97, was then blocked by the FTC. Later on, Office Depot, number 2 in the market, managed to merge with the number 3 in the market, Office Max, and they were successful in saying that Amazon was a significant competitor at the B2C level. So then Staples and Office Depot thought, well, maybe if that went through, maybe we'll try for a merger between the number 1 and number 2 in the market, and notified it again. Basically making 2 arguments. I mean, their core argument was about whether B2B is a separate market. I'm only going to mention 2 here. One is on the fact that they were competing with regional players in the market, and they heavily denied that there is a nationwide market for office supply. That doesn't play a huge role in the decision, and ultimately the judge said, no, this is a nationwide market. Yeah, and the other argument was about the penguins and how Amazon was not only a player in the B2C segment, but also clearly announced its intention to be a major player in the B2B area. Once again, the court said that they were a bit uncertain about how effective their entry in the market would be, concluded that it was probably too soon to conclude that such a merger could be cleared. And I'll conclude with another sentence from this judgment, and then I'll leave it up to you to take your own conclusions. The court appreciates the tremendous amount of time, money, and effort defendants put into this case, and understands that they genuinely believe this merger would be best for their companies, the industry, and the public. While the court's decision is surely a great disappointment to defendants, the court is optimistic that defendants will find ways to innovate, evolve, and remain relevant in the rapidly changing office supply industry. I'll leave it here. Thank you.
Charming. Okay, well, I would like to give the floor briefly to Amelia and Bruce, since many of the comments do reflect directly their paper. I'd like to give them a chance to respond.
But you go first.
Okay. Well, I mean, thank you very much for all the comments. If we come back to Hans's comments, which are probably the most directly well, in fact, Julio's were very, very directly related, but I agreed with absolutely all of them, so I don't have any comments on this. Hans, actually, I don't know why we didn't spot the paper that Lars Henrik did in this, but I think this idea of counting paragraphs is a fascinating one, and we did count paragraphs a little bit, although we didn't report very much of it. But it was again about this overlap, basically where the supply-side substitution arguments go. So we essentially looked at exactly the same question without realising it. How much are they in the market definition section and how much are they in the competitive assessment section? Now, one thing we found was there was inconsistency. Sometimes there was a lot in the market definition section, sometimes there wasn't much. There was quite a lot of cross-reference, there was quite a lot of repetition. And that was one of the things that led us to feel, and you're right, you could go the other way. We think it's better this way, but the key thing is being clear about where it should go. Because otherwise you end up with people not knowing what point at which they're meant to make their arguments, people not knowing at what point to find them in the decisions, lots of repetition, lots of confusion. So and we definitely found ones where there was a lot in the market definition section. So in Arsenal DSP, we counted, this was one of the ones in the report, 44 paragraphs on supply-side substitution in the market definition section, 11 in the competitive assessment, although the competitive assessment then referring back to the market definition section, but also bringing in extra information in the competitive assessment section that it really wasn't obvious why it wasn't of the same sort as the evidence presented in the market definition section. So it doesn't seem clear where this stuff goes. So we thought more clarity about where this stuff goes, and we would recommend in the competitive assessment section, means that kind of everyone knows the game they're playing, but it does potentially have some implications for the market definition guidelines, actually, because if those 6 forms of evidence that we described, some of them do play more to competitive assessment. Certainly some of the econometric evidence, the stuff on import elasticity, is more in that context about the competitive assessment and less about the market definition. On the vertical integration point, I think we agree, absolutely, but I'll maybe leave Bruce, because he was particularly interested in this point.
Well, yes, but let me just, I think I've been rather more forceful on the supply-side substitution. I've no idea where this, I had no idea that Henrik had written this paper. What I did see was a 4-page summary from the ERT, European Roundtable of Industrialists, which said, well, market definition is completely hopeless because it doesn't bring in the sort of business planning horizons of 5 to 8 years that they might come into the market, and we should include all these firms and also potential innovators. Now, I'm not sure if this was a parody of, I'm very surprised that Henrik was behind that or would have approved of really something which I think is quite outrageous, that is not appropriate for setting up market definition, though could be important on, I should say I'm a great friend and admirer of Henrik's and have been for many years. So I suspect that the publicity on the 4-page summary was not like the actual report, which I'd love to see. But I do think very strongly, actually, that you shouldn't get involved in this supply-side substitution in the market definition side, because it just messes things up. It ruins focus. It's just not sensible for the initial construction of market shares. Supply-side substitution is very, very important, but it is about competitiveness and competitive assessment, and that's where it should go. So I would be strong on that.
I do agree.
Media's much too polite. Raphael, sort of a geographical guppy. Well, I mean, the Commission only uses the product guppy in telecom cases, when it often does a parallel merger simulation, a full merger simulation at the same time. I don't think that we're close to sort of leaving out market definition and combining in a guppy type measure because it hasn't taken off as much as I'd expected it to on the product side. I was absolutely fascinated by the penguins example, which I hadn't picked up. Actually, it's sort of it reminded me. I've got a friend who worked for the British Antarctic Survey, who spends her life counting penguins from aerial photographs to see how they've been moving around. And it strikes me that maybe I should invite Amelia, Hans, and Volker to dinner with Mary, this friend, counting paragraphs and counting penguins. Right. I don't think I've got time to go into the vertical, but I'd love to go into that SSA case because I think it does, but that's not.
Well, we are about 15 minutes or slightly less from the nominal end of the session.
But may I quickly respond to Bruce's point? Yes. Just a 3-minute, 2-minute version of it. I think one conclusion I would take out of this kind of discussion is we have to be careful in how we are using market shares. Is for me one reading. But still, without having Henrik sitting here and me trying to defend him, the first point I just want to make is I found an interesting quote by the commissioner on exactly this kind of statistics, and she was saying that more recently it seems that the type of market definition practice has changed. Namely, now we are seeing the majority of the cases being EEA-wide or global. So there seemed to be a difference in how we are applying market definition 10 years ago when Henrik was doing this kind of analysis, and today with the markets becoming broader and broader, which I think is somehow a relief, I guess, for the industrialists which were putting forward their case. But still, I have the feeling a little bit underestimated, eventually in your paper, or at least in our discussion, is the dynamic dimension of geographic market definition. And I think the case of this industrialists here is all about this dynamic. The market is today national, but it will be tomorrow a different animal. And we are competing already head-to-head with others for this future market. And this kind of perspective is difficult to bring together. I reread the market definition guidelines. Interestingly, they have a specific notion of the integration of the European market should be taken into account when we are defining markets. And I just wonder whether this kind of statement is not relaying to that specific notion, invoking that more often and having you commission there a more careful view on whether they should take a more forward-looking perspective to market definition. And I here just also want to throw in a notion I recently heard it was put forward by Nicolas Petit, which was called monopolies, as a combination of monopolies and oligopolies, and it was quoting to the Googles, Facebooks, Amazons, Apples, Microsofts, and saying, well, listen, if you look at the viewer market, it's all national. It's all national markets with national preferences, and you want to get the German Facebook user on your page. But those guys, when you read in their financial reports, they consider themselves to be leading competitors vis-a-vis. So it's Google considers Amazon one of their core competitors, and Facebook, Amazon. So they seem to stay into some meta competition game. And I think, again, a question which is difficult to address in market definition is how we bring in this kind of dimension of competition and link it to the narrow market definition, which I fully agree we have to do to protect the individual customer, but still this other dimension must not be lost.
Koenig asked me for 1 minute.
Yeah, even less. Just a 30-second clarification, maybe, following Bruce's comment on the GUPI. I was not advocating that we get rid of the of geographic market definition at all. I just think it's very, very important. My main message is we don't want to stop at market shares when we spend time defining geographic markets, and there's so much more that we should do, and I think that's a bit the risk if too much time is spent on the geographic market definition if afterwards one stop at market share, and there's so much more we can do.
Thank you. Okay, well, I'm brimming with questions, but I'm pretty sure you are too. And given that the nominal end of the session is in about 10 minutes, I'd like to hand off immediately to the audience. Questions? Yes, please. Please identify yourself.
In points of your study, thank you. And also, Bruce, to your maybe more or less polite comments on the role of supply-side substitution. No, but my question is on, let's say, your counting of paragraphs, and I think you referred to the Arsenal case where, let's say, 30 paragraphs were in market definition and 10 were in the assessment. My question is, was there any relation, let's say, with the time horizon? Because normally supply-side substitution is sort of, within 1 year, easy supply substitution. Of course, you have also longer term horizon entry, ability to indeed switch supply. So could it be that those 10 paragraphs in the assessment are more about those longer term entry possibilities?
No, they were essentially, all of them were about the extent to which US and Chinese imports were a sufficient competitive constraint on the EEA market, and they were all about the same question, actually. In that particular case, I can see your point, but actually we started out the work thinking that the time horizon might be something we were really going to focus on, and looking at the extent to which supply-side substitution in a short time period was probably looked at in market definition, and longer time period competitive assessment. And the more we thought about it, the more we thought actually it's about the more important aspect is this near universality. And actually the immediacy is less important. If you want the market shares to mean something as a decent proxy for competition.
More questions?
Power and effects, but in reality we all know that this is not the case. The psychological importance of market shares is enormous, and if you look at prohibitions, whoever has done them, and certainly also the European Commission, you will find that at the end of the day, given all the other reflections taking away, it is ultimately market share, high shares, which give the authorities the the inner justification and the power and to bring these cases through. So unfortunately, I think it's not an innocent question where you analyze these issues, and if you say, okay, you make a clear separation of the two things, that's fine. But then you end up the market share analysis with 60% market. Then you normally, that case is done. There is nothing to I mean, there's some exceptions, but it's really almost nothing to be done, because the other elements are then analyzed later on, and they're analyzed in a kind of a more defensive way, which are always colored by the high share. So I think it is that problem which we would need to solve first before we can say it doesn't matter where we look at them. Thank you.
Well, and I suspect Julien might have something to say about that, and I appreciate the view from the inside. But as an outsider looking at this, and over the last few years, I've been getting some research associates to look at all merger decisions and look at the market shares of the reported market shares, always in brackets, but take the midpoint, of decisions. And actually, there's no clear 40% rule or any other rule. It's really becoming fuzzier and fuzzier, which I take as being a good sign that there's more and more analysis going into what the competitive effects actually are, and that the market share is a starting point, a very important starting point, but there's quite a bit of variation around that, and there are markets with quite, I can't immediately recall these because I looked at the my spreadsheets for some time, but there are some with quite high market shares which are not found to be a problem, and some with low market shares, especially when there's something else in there to do with vertical integration or potential coordinated effects, or something where a lower market share can be seen to find a problem. So I don't think it's as, it's as sharp as in the imagination for many people. So I think that when you look at it statistically, it is not sharp that market share any longer, if it ever did, but any longer defines whether there's an impediment to competition or not.
I agree with that, but I also think that there is a bit of an understanding question that still needs to be dealt with. I think that economists are really quite relaxed about market shares being an initial indication and actually looking at the wider set of competitive constraints. I think that then when you go to your equivalent, I mean, my experience is in the UK, but you go to your equivalent of legal service, they go, what, 25% joint market share, and you want to find this a problem? Or, 90% market share, and it's not a problem. So trying to get that change in mindset amongst some lawyers, I think some lawyers completely get it, is quite important. And I actually think then the media as well, learning to tell a story in the media about why these merger decisions are right, is also important, because I remember, we got quite chastised in the media about a couple of OFT merger decisions where the market shares looked like we should be making different decisions, but we were determined not to just doctor our market to get the market definition and the market shares that might make the media communications a bit easier, because we didn't think those were right. So I think that education system is partly why we gave our first recommendation, which is that the Commission should be clearer about the role of market definition. Do Julia want to answer?
No, I think.
Oh, sorry. Yes.
Given that Bruce. No, I think. I agree with Bruce and Amelia. Goetz obviously has some points. From his experience, of course, but also from his knowledge of the field. But perhaps a slightly gloomy picture on the importance of structural indicators. I think in the cases also, in oligopoly markets, like mobile markets or GIASM is one of them, where there was an assessment. A broader assessment of competitive structure and closeness. Obviously the presence of barriers to entry, so the entry assessment plays a very important role. So that's really an assessment about, can you go beyond market shares? In which way do you go beyond market shares to come to your conclusion? And also in cases like, say, Outokumpu Inoxum or Ineos Solvay, where there was a debate on market definition, and for example, in Ineos Solvay, had you gone EA-wide, you would have had a lower market share. You would have had, in those cases, in any event, you would have had an issue of geographical closeness that would have probably led to the same outcome. And you had lots of evidence on past consolidation leading to competitive or to a worsening of competitive conditions. And that's a major part of the decision. So the Commission did not just stop in that case at the market share in the relevant market. It went well beyond that to check whether that type of market structure, in light of past evidence, was likely to lead to an impediment of competition. So I do think, I don't have the statistical information that Bruce was referring to, but I do think in practice, Commission is quite careful to have much more information than just a structural indicator before reaching a conclusion.
Very quick. I just want to say, I think we will be getting used to higher market shares in the digital world very soon. I were working on one case which was on a merger on two yellow page providers. This was a 2-to-1 merger, which was accepted by the Dutch Competition Authority because of internet competition. And recently, the Bundeskartellamt was accepting a 3-to-2 merger at the Bundeskartellamt for Immowelt, Immoweb, so two property selling matching platforms. So we will get used, and that is good. That may break a little bit this presumption that a 80% market share is a bad thing.
A very short comment in line with what you just said, and also in line with Jacques Steenbergen, President of the Belgian Competition Authority. From my experience, I have the feeling that market shares, yes, they are not the only thing one looks at, also not at the decision-making stage, that high market shares are not necessarily stopping you from saying yes, but low market shares are far more likely to stop you from saying no. So they seem to have far more impact on the thinking of colleges in one direction than in the other. Now, as to the point of, can you not start playing with the market definition in order to get closer to where you would like to come? That has to be done in an earlier stage. If once you are in front of the college, you cannot start playing with the market definitions anymore. All you can do then is open a second phase, and that is something, at least, we try to avoid. Not at all costs, but almost.
One last question.